The track was wrong. I knew it before I crouched down. I knew it before my knees popped and the cold mud soaked through my work pants. The print in that soft creek bank was shaped like a man's foot, but wider at the ball, longer in the arch and the toes. The toes left deep puncture marks, not impressions, punctures, like something pressing down with intent, not just walking through. I put my whole hand inside it and my fingers didn't reach the edges. I'm not a small man. I've got hands that have split cordwood for 40 years, hands that have pulled fence posts and dressed deer in the dark. My hand looked like a child's thing sitting inside that track. I stayed crouched there for a long time. The creek was running low. It was late October 2003, and we hadn't had rain in 3 weeks. The leaves were down and dry, the color of rust and old blood, and they skittered across the mudbank in the wind coming off the tree line. I could smell the creek, iron and cold, and something else underneath it. Something animal and dense like a wet dog left in a closed room for a week. I stood up slow. I looked at the tree line across the water. Nothing moved. Nothing called. And the woods just sat there the way woods do when something in them is watching you and waiting to see what you'll do next. I walked back to the house. I didn't run. I want to be clear about that. I've been scared in my life. I've been scared bad. But I didn't run. I walked back across the lower field, climbed the fence at the post by the old locust tree and went inside. I put a pot of coffee on and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at where the tree line was going dark. The sun was already below it. The sky behind the oaks was the color of a bruise, purple and orange and fading fast. I told myself a bear. I told myself an old boar with splayed feet, a big one, maybe 350 pounds, moving down to the creek to drink before the cold set in hard. I told myself that. I want you to understand that I told myself that for a long time, and part of me believed it, and part of me knew I was lying, and that second part never really stopped knowing. I'd been on that land since 1989, 14 years by that October morning, and I knew every bear track, every deer trail, every place the coyotes denned up in the South Hollow. I'd walked every acre of that property in every season. I knew the way the land breathed. I knew where the creek ran cold even in August and where it went warm and shallow by the beaver pond. I knew the tree that got hit by lightning in '94 and the way the scar on its trunk had healed over crooked, like a bad weld. I knew this land the way you know a place you've poured yourself into for years, the way the soil gets under your fingernails and stays there, the way you stop seeing it and start just being part of it. So, when I say the track was wrong, I'm not speaking as a man who startled at shadows. I'm speaking as a man who had spent 14 years learning to read that ground, and the ground was telling me something I didn't want to hear. That's the thing nobody understands. The land knew before I did. The land had probably known for longer than I wanted to think about. My nearest neighbor was Herschel Baines, 3/4 of a mile up the dirt road to the east. Herschel was 70-something, a retired machinist who kept a few goats and spent most of his time fishing the same stretch of creek I was standing beside that morning. We weren't close friends. We were the kind of neighbors that rural people become when they respect each other enough to leave each other alone. We waved from trucks. Or we helped when trucks got stuck in mud. We didn't visit. A few days after I found the track, Herschel's truck came up my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, which had never happened in 14 years. I met him at the door. He had his hat in his hands and he was working the brim in a circle, the way a man does when he's trying to decide how much to say. He said he'd lost 2 goats. Said they didn't get taken the way coyotes take things, scattered and torn and left in pieces across the yard. Said they were just gone. Said the fence was pushed down, not broken through. Pushed down from outside in, like something had leaned on it. He didn't look at me when he said the next part. He said he'd seen something 2 nights ago coming out of the woodlot behind his barn. Upright, moving fast on 2 legs, too tall to be a man. He said he didn't know what it was, and he wasn't saying he did. He put his hat back on and said he just thought I ought to know, living alone down here with nothing between me and the South Woods. He drove off before I could find the words to say anything worth saying. I stood on my porch and listened to his truck fade up the road, and then listened to the quiet that came after. The field was full of dry corn stubble. I hadn't gotten around to turning it under yet. The stalks were pale and brittle in the afternoon light, rattling in the wind off the woods. The sound of them was like something dry being crushed, over and over, rhythmic and small. I went inside and got my rifle and checked it, and put it by the back door. That was October 22nd, 2003. I remember the date because it was 2 days before my 56th birthday, and I remember thinking that if I was going to live this far into my life without knowing what the world actually contained, finding out now seemed like a poor birthday present. I didn't sleep well that week. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and to the wind in the oaks outside, and to the nothing that filled the space between those sounds. I wasn't afraid the way you're afraid of an intruder. It was different. It was the fear of a category error. The fear that the map you've been using to understand where you live is simply wrong, and you don't know how wrong, and you don't know what the right map looks like. That kind of fear sits in the chest differently. It doesn't spike. It just stays, low and constant and very cold. The first time I saw it was November 9th, a Monday. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a thin skim of ice on the water bucket I kept outside for the dog I no longer had. It was just past 5 in the morning and still full dark, and I was coming back from the outhouse, which I still used in those years because the septic had backed up in late September, and I hadn't gotten a plumber out yet. I had a flashlight. I was looking at the tree line. I was looking at the ground because the frost had made the path slick, and I was wearing old work boots with the tread worn smooth. I heard the sound first. Not a growl, not a howl, something lower and more deliberate. A sound that came from a chest much deeper than any chest I'd ever stood near. It moved the air. I felt it in my sternum. I stopped walking. I turned the flashlight toward the south field. The beam went about 60 feet before it lost itself in the dark. At the edge of the light, at the absolute edge where the dark was winning, there was a shape. It was standing. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. It was covered in something dark and matted, and it was holding very still the way animals hold still when they're deciding whether to move. I could see its shoulders. They were wide in a way that didn't correspond to anything I had a name for. It turned its head toward the light. I saw 2 points of reflection, eyes catching my beam the way a deer's eyes catch headlights, but higher off the ground, much higher and further apart. We stood there, both of us, for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then it turned and moved into the south field darkness, and I heard the corn stubble crunch under it, with a sound like someone walking through a room full of broken glass, each footfall heavy and deliberate, until the sound faded into the tree line and was gone. I went inside. I sat in the kitchen chair and I put my hands flat on the table and I watched them shake until they stopped. I told myself I would call someone. I thought about who that would be. The county sheriff's office, to say what exactly? Wildlife management, to report what precisely? I had no proof. I had a track in mud that had since been rained on and smeared. I had Herschel's story, which he had told me privately and which he would probably deny if it meant someone writing things down about him. I had a shape at the edge of a flashlight beam in the dark at 5 in the morning, seen by a 55-year-old man who lived alone and had been short on sleep for 2 weeks. I could hear how that sounded. I decided I wouldn't call anyone. I decided I would watch. That decision changed everything that came after. Every single thing. December came in hard. The first real snow hit on the 3rd, 8 inches overnight, and when I went out in the morning to split the wood I hadn't gotten around to stacking, the field was white and clean and still, and the tree line beyond it stood up black and absolute against a sky the color of old pewter. I worked for an hour, swinging the maul, stacking the quarters against the barn wall. My breath made clouds. The wood was well-dried white oak, and it split clean with a sound like a rifle crack each time the maul came down. I was about an hour in when I noticed the stillness. Birds had been working the field when I started. Small, dark shapes moving through the stubble that showed through the snow. They were gone. Not flown away in a flock, the way they go when a hawk comes over. Just gone, the way they go when something larger and slower is moving, and they want no part of whatever comes next. I kept splitting. I told myself to keep splitting. I set another piece on the block and brought the maul up and brought it down, and when I looked up there was a sound from the tree line. Not a branch breaking, more like a deliberate contact with a tree trunk, a heavy rhythmic knock. 1, then silence, then 2 more, then silence, then once more. I set the maul down and stood with my gloves on and my hands at my sides, and I looked at the tree line and I waited. Nothing came out. After maybe 5 minutes, the birds came back. The knocking didn't repeat. I finished splitting the wood and went inside and stood at the window and thought about the space between what I knew and what I could prove, and understood they were getting further apart. It was my habit in those years to leave kitchen scraps out for the crows. I'd done it since the first year on the property, a habit I'd picked up from my mother, who believed crows were good luck if you treated them right. I used a flat piece of shale about the size of a dinner plate that sat near the corner of the woodpile, and I'd put out bread ends, apple cores, the fat trimmed from pork. The crows came every morning. I knew them by their patterns, which ones were bold and which ones hung back. They knew me by my coat, I think, because they'd come closer when I was in the gray canvas work coat and stay further when I wore the orange one I used in deer season. That flat piece of shale. That was the thing between us. Not between me and the crows. Between me and what was coming. I didn't know that yet. I'm telling you now, because you deserve to know what you're watching for. The second week of December, I went out in the early morning and found the shale had been moved. Not knocked over, not disturbed. Moved. Set back from the woodpile by about 4 feet and turned 90 degrees. Still flat, still right side up, like someone had carried it and placed it with some care. The scraps I'd left the night before were gone. The crows hadn't come yet. There were no tracks in the snow around the shale, except for a depression on each side of it, like something had stood very close on either side when it lifted the stone. The depressions weren't clear footprints. The snow was too hard and crusted, but they were the right distance apart for a very large biped standing with its feet placed deliberately. I stood there in the cold, looking at the moved stone for a long time. The sky was just getting light. The oaks were black against it, and the field ran away from me, white and featureless to the south. I picked up the shale and carried it back to its place by the woodpile. I put fresh scraps on it. I went inside. I didn't know why I did it. I didn't have a reason I could have explained to another person. It just seemed like the right response, like answering a knock at the door, like acknowledging that something had said something and I had heard it. That was how it started. that moved stone in a crusted December field at first light in the cold. I've turned that morning over in my mind more times than I can count. I've tried to find the moment where I could have made a different choice, taken a different road out of that particular crossroads, but I can't find it. Every time I go back, I end up doing the same thing. Picking up the stone, carrying it back, putting fresh scraps down, going inside. Some things feel less like decisions than like gravity. You don't choose to fall. You just find yourself falling and understand afterward that you were always going to. By January of 2004, I had seen it 3 more times. Never close, never in full light. Always at the periphery, at the edge of visibility, in the gray time between dark and morning, or at the last minutes of dusk when color was leaving the world and everything reduced to shapes and movement. Each time it was still. Each time it watched. Each time it left without rushing, moving into the trees with a steadiness that wasn't hurry, but also wasn't unconcerned. It was calibrated. That's the word I kept coming back to in those weeks. Calibrated. Like something that had decided how close to come and was sticking to that distance with deliberate precision. The scraps kept disappearing from the shale, not every night. Maybe 4 nights in 7. I started noticing which nights they went. Clear nights mostly, cold nights when the temperature dropped hard after dark and the sky was full of stars and the snow settled and creaked in the cold. Whoever, whatever, it preferred those nights. I started leaving more. I started leaving better things. I started cutting pieces of deer meat from the freezer, venison I'd put up in October, and leaving that out alongside the kitchen scraps. I don't know when the line between leaving scraps for crows and leaving food for something I was afraid of became the line between leaving food for something I was afraid of and leaving food for something I was beginning to think of as a presence with its own logic. I don't know exactly when that happened. I know it happened before spring. March came. The snow went off the field slowly, the way it does in Michigan when the season is reluctant. The melt ran in small dark channels through the stubble. The mud came. The mud in Michigan in March is a specific thing. Dark and cold and deep. The kind of mud that takes your boot and holds it and sometimes wins. I was out patching the fence on the east side of the property on a Saturday mid-March, working alone the way I always worked, and I was pulling staples from an old post with a hammer claw when I heard a sound from the ditch that ran along the fence line. A young sound. Not young like a cub or a fawn. Young like something that hadn't fully learned the size of its own voice, testing a register it wasn't sure of yet. I set the hammer down and looked toward the ditch. The ditch was overgrown with last year's cattail and dried sedge, all of it brown and matted from the winter, and at first I saw nothing. Then the cattail moved. Not from wind, there was no wind, from something moving through it, something low and working its way along the ditch toward the open end where it met the culvert under the road. I didn't move. The cattail rustled, then stopped. Then a shape pushed through the last of the dry sedge at the end of the ditch and stopped at the edge of the open mud. It was not a bear cub. It was not a coyote pup. It was something shaped like a small person, but built wrong. Built heavier through the chest and shoulders, with long arms and a wide face mostly obscured by dark hair that lay flat and wet looking against its skull. It was maybe 4 feet tall. Standing on 2 legs, looking at me. I guessed it was young. There was something about its eyes that suggested youth, something uncertain and wide in the way they held on my face, the way a child looks at a stranger before it has learned to hide what it feels. I didn't move. It looked at me for a long time. Then, something in the tree line to the south made a sound, low and carrying, the same chest-deep sound I had heard in November. The young one turned toward the trees. Then it turned back to me. Then it went. It moved into the tree line in 3 seconds. Gone. I stood there in the mud with the hammer in my hand and the sky heavy and gray above me and the field empty in every direction. I started to understand, standing there, that the distance had been changing, that what had been calibrating its approach to me all winter had also been letting something else get closer, something smaller, something that maybe didn't know yet to be careful. I went back to the shale that night. I cut 2 pieces of venison and laid them out with some bread and a handful of dried corn. I put them on the shale and I stood there for a moment in the dark, in the cold, in the field that was mine and also evidently something else's. And I talked out loud for the first time. I said it plain. I said I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I said whatever had been coming to the stone could keep coming. I said the young one was welcome too. I stood there feeling like a fool, and also feeling like whatever I was doing was the most sensible thing I'd done since October. Then I went inside. The venison was gone by morning, both pieces. The bread was untouched. I noted that. Spring came. April melted into May, and the fields greened up, and the creek came back full and cold and quick with snowmelt from up north. The young one started coming to the stone. Not every night. Not even most nights. But sometimes in the early dark, I would look out the kitchen window and there would be a shape crouched at the shale. Low and still, eating. If I moved to the window too fast, the shape would go. If I stood back from the glass and moved slow and stayed still, it would sometimes stay for 5 or 10 minutes before it faded back into the field and the dark took it. I started leaving the kitchen light off so there would be no glass reflection to warn it. I started moving through my own house at night like a man trying not to disturb something fragile. I noticed that I was arranging my life around its comfort without having decided to do so. I noticed this and kept doing it anyway. By June, it was coming to the shale in full dark and staying longer. I started sitting on the back porch on warm evenings, far enough from the shale that I was outside its threshold of alarm, close enough to watch. I sat without a flashlight, without a lantern, in the dark of my own property, listening to the field. The fireflies were out by mid-June. The corn was knee-high in the south field. I had put in a small garden that year, beans and tomatoes and squash along the back fence, and the garden was doing well in the warm, wet June. I sat on the porch step with a cup of coffee gone cold, and I watched the fireflies move above the garden, and I listened. On the 3rd night of sitting this way, I heard the grass move in the field, and then the sound of the young one at the shale, the small scrape of stone against stone as it shifted the slab to get at whatever was underneath the edge. I had noticed it did this sometimes, shifted the stone, moved it slightly, and I had started to understand this as something more than eating. It was handling the stone. It was interested in the stone itself. I kept very still on the step. The fireflies moved. The corn rustled once in a small breath of air and went still. The eating sounds continued for a while and then stopped. Then there was quiet for a long time. Then, from very close, maybe 30 feet, maybe less, I heard a sound that was not an animal sound, and not a human sound, but was somewhere between them. A kind of low vocalization, without direction, without urgency, like something saying a word in a language built from completely different materials than the one I spoke. I didn't answer. I sat and listened. After a while, there was the sound of grass again, and the field was empty, and I was alone on the step with the fireflies and the cold coffee and a feeling in my chest I couldn't name. Not fear. Something wider than fear, something that had fear in it the way a river has tributaries. Fear was there, yes, but so was something else. Something I am only now, sitting here as an old man, able to call wonder. Summer of 2004, I started leaving the stone in different places, not far. 10 feet one night, 20 feet another direction the next. I wanted to see if it would follow the stone or return to the original location. It followed the stone. Every time. I moved it back after a few nights and it continued to come. I moved it once to the corner of the porch step, directly below where I liked to sit. That night I did not sit on the step. I sat in the lawn chair at the corner of the house, 25 feet away, and I waited. It came in the full dark, around 9:30. I heard it in the grass, and then I heard it on the porch gravel, and then I heard it at the stone, eating. I could hear the sounds clearly from where I sat. The wet sounds of eating and the small sounds it made, the vocalizations I was coming to recognize as part of how it expressed a kind of contentment or ease. It sounded young. It sounded like something that had not yet learned to be fully afraid. When it finished, it didn't go immediately. It sat or crouched near the stone. I could hear it breathing. I could smell it on the warm night air. The smell was strong and animal and heavy, not unpleasant to me by then, not the smell of threat or rot, just the dense, deep smell of a wild thing. We sat in the dark together, 30 feet apart, not looking at each other, in a field in Michigan in the middle of summer, while the fireflies moved above the garden and something in the south woods breathed low and slow and waited. I named it that summer. I didn't plan to. Names change things. I knew names change things, but by August I was calling it by a name in my own head, only in my own head, only when I thought about it, which was more often than I admitted to myself. I called it Silas. I don't know why, it was a name I had any particular feeling about. It was just the name that attached itself to the presence, to the shape at the stone, to the young, careful thing in the field. Silas. I never said it out loud, not that year, not for a long time after, but I knew that naming it meant I had made a decision, even if I didn't have the honesty to recognize that yet. 2005. The year settled into patterns. Silas at the stone 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes more. The large presence in the south woods continuing to maintain its distance from the house and from me, seen occasionally at the field edge, sometimes heard knocking in the trees, never approaching. I told myself the large one was watching to see if I was a danger to the young one. I told myself I was being assessed, that as long as I continued to demonstrate that I was safe, the large one would stay back. This felt logical. This felt like something I could manage. I was comfortable with a problem I could manage. The problem with that comfort was that it required me to keep narrowing the definition of what I was actually doing. It required me not to ask the questions that would have complicated the comfortable story I was telling myself. Questions like, at what point does feeding a wild animal make it dependent? At what point does dependency become something more like relationship? At what point does relationship carry obligations? I didn't ask those questions in 2005. I was 57 years old, living alone on 140 acres in rural Michigan, and I'd found a thing to care for in a life that had, in recent years, become somewhat short on things to care for. I didn't examine that too hard. By spring of 2006, Silas was coming to the stone in the early evening before full dark. This was a change. Through the previous winter it had come only well after dark, sometimes near midnight. Now it was coming in the last, real light of the day, around 8 or 8:30, when the sky was still deep blue in the west and the field was visible in the dusk. I started coming out to sit on the step again in the evenings, closer to the stone than I'd sat before. The first time Silas came and found me on the step, about 12 feet from the stone, it stopped in the field. I could see it clearly in the dusk. It was taller than it had been in March of 2004, maybe 5 feet now, still thick through the chest. the same wide face with the flat, dark hair. It stood in the field and looked at me. I looked at it. I did not speak. I did not move. After maybe 2 minutes, it came to the stone and ate. That close, I could hear everything. The sounds it made. The way it handled the food carefully before it ate. The way it paused twice and turned its head to look at me while it was eating. Not with alarm, with something more like acknowledgement. Like checking that I was still where I had been, still not doing anything worrying. I sat very still. When it finished eating, it sat near the stone for a while, and in the last of the dusk I could see it moving the stone again, the same handling it had always done, turning it slightly, running its long dark fingers along the edge of the shale. It held the stone the way a person holds something familiar, not examining it, just holding it. After a while, it went back into the field and into the dark. I sat on the step for a long time after it left. The stars were coming out. The field was empty and quiet. I thought about the stone and the way it had held the stone and what that meant about the difference between feeding an animal and something else. I thought about Herschel's goats, gone in the fall of 2003, and whether the large presence had stopped taking things since the stone had been established, since the food had been made available. I thought it probably had. I had not heard of any other losses from Herschel or from anyone else in the 3 years since. Whether that was correlation or cause, I couldn't say. But I thought it was probably cause. I thought the stone was doing more than I had designed it to do. I thought it had become something neither Silas nor I had planned, but that both of us, in our separate ways, understood. 2007. By summer, Silas would take food from my hand. Not the first time I tried. The first time I tried, in late April, extending a piece of venison toward it while it stood at the stone, it made a sound I hadn't heard before, a short, sharp exhalation, and moved back 12 feet and watched me for a long time before it left without eating. I put the food on the stone and went inside. It came back and ate after dark. I tried again in early May, same distance, same gesture, and it stood its ground that time. Didn't take the food but didn't back away. It watched my hand. I set the food on the stone and withdrew my hand slowly. It came to the stone and ate and looked at my hand and ate again. The third time, in the second week of June, a warm evening with the air soft and carrying the smell of the garden, it stepped forward and took the venison from my open palm. The touch of its fingers on my hand lasted maybe 2 seconds. The fingers were long, and the skin on the pads was rough and very warm. It took the food and backed away and ate it with its eyes on my face. I sat on the step and held my hand still and didn't move and didn't speak. I felt something in my chest that I have no word for, even now. Something that opened rather than closed. Something that was both privilege and warning in the same moment, though I only felt the privilege then. The warning I only understood later. I should have understood it. The warning was always there, dressed up as wonder, hiding in the warmth of those summer evenings. I was 60 years old by 2008, and I had been feeding Silas for nearly 5 years, and I had been telling myself a story about what we were to each other, and the story was mostly true, as far as it went. But a story that stops before the hard part is not an honest story. It's a comfortable one, and comfortable stories have a cost. The summer of 2008, Silas started bringing things to the stone. I came out one morning in July, and there was a turkey feather on the shale beside the food scraps it had left the night before. Long and dark, banded at the tip, laid across the stone with its quill end pointing toward the house. The next week, there was a chunk of quartz, white and rough, about the size of my fist. The week after that, a piece of deer antler, shed, smooth-tipped, heavy. I left these things on the stone. I did not disturb them. Over the weeks and months, they accumulated at the edge of the shale, a small collection of objects that Silas had carried from wherever it ranged in the South Woods and placed there. I came to understand this as a form of communication I didn't have the language to fully read, but could feel the intent of. It was saying something about the stone, about the space the stone occupied in its life. It was saying the stone was a place where things were exchanged. I added to the stone, too. Not just food. I started leaving small things. A smooth river stone Id kept on the windowsill for years. A piece of copper wire bent into a rough circle. An arrowhead Id turned up plowing the east field, dark and finely worked, probably a jibway, maybe 400 years old. I left that one on the stone on a morning in late September and came out the next day to find it gone, replaced by the piece of quartz moved to the center of the shale, placed just so. 2009. The exchange continued. The seasons continued. Winter and the cold and the shortened days, and Silas coming to the stone in the dark and eating and sometimes sitting near it in the cold, visible from my kitchen window as a dark shape against the snow. I put a battery lantern on the porch that winter, low and aimed away from the stone, enough light that I could see from the window without disturbing the feeding. I watched it through the glass on cold January nights, the dark shape at the stone, still and crouched and then moving, the steam of its breath in the lantern light. I was 61 that January. I had spent more than a quarter of my adult life in proximity to this thing. I thought about that sometimes, lying in the dark before sleep, running the years backward and finding the thread of it woven into every season since that October morning when I first crouched over the track in the creek bank mud. I thought about what I might have said to the man I was then, on his knees in the cold mud with his hand inside a print too large for any honest explanation. I could not think of a single word that would have made any difference. Some things you walk toward because the alternative is walking backward and you are not built for that. Spring of 2010. 6.5 years. The question I had been not quite asking for most of those years was about the large presence. The one in the South Woods. The one that had been there since the beginning. Maintaining its distance. Watching. I had not seen it clearly in perhaps 2 years. I had heard it, the knocking in the trees. Once or twice the deep chest sound carrying across the field on a still night. But it had not appeared at the field edge. Had not shown itself the way it had in those early years when it was calibrating me. I took this as a good sign. I told myself it had decided I was acceptable. I told myself the distance it kept was a form of tolerance. I was wrong about what it meant and right about what it was feeling, in a way I wouldn't understand until September. September 15th, 2010. A Wednesday. Cold front moving through from the north. The sky low and gray and smelling of the first real autumn cold. The kind that signals an end rather than a pause. I was in the barn doing late maintenance on the tractor, replacing the fuel filter, my hands greasy and cold, working by the light of a trouble lamp hooked on the lift arm. It was around 7 in the evening. I had fed Silas an hour earlier, left the stone laid with venison and bread, and seen the shape come across the field in the dusk and take the food. Normal, routine. Everything exactly as it had been for years. I was under the tractor when I heard the sound on the barn floor. Not at the door, inside. Something was already inside the barn. I came out from under the tractor fast, hitting my shoulder on the frame in a way that sent a white pain through the joint, and I grabbed the trouble lamp and swung it up and around. The light hit the back of the barn where the old hay bales from 2 years ago were stacked against the wall. It was standing there, not Silas, the large one. I knew immediately it was not Silas. The size was wrong. The size was everything I remembered from that first night in 2003, The shape in the field at the edge of my flashlight beam, the wide shoulders and the height. 7.5 feet at least, maybe 8, standing in my barn. Not crouched, not in a posture of aggression, just standing, filling the space between the hay bales and the roof beam above them with its mass and its stillness. Its eyes caught the trouble lamp the same way they had caught my flashlight all those years ago. 2 amber points of reflection, widely spaced, looking at me. I had a wrench in my hand. I didn't raise it. I didn't back away. My shoulder was screaming, and my hands were greasy. And I was 62 years old, and I was standing 10 feet from something that could have taken me apart without effort, and I did not move. We stood there. The lamp swung slightly on its cord, and the shadows moved on the walls. Then it made the sound. Not the chest-deep territorial sound I'd heard in the field. Something different. Something that rose in pitch at the end. Something almost interrogative, a rising inflection on the final note of it. I did not have the language. I did not know what it was asking, but I understood what kind of moment this was. The same way you understand when you are being introduced to someone important. When someone important to someone important to you has decided, finally, to look at you face to face. I said the only thing I could think to say. I said, "Silas is all right." I said it twice. I have no idea if those words meant anything to it. I have no idea if my tone carried a meaning my words couldn't, but I said it, and it stood there and heard it. And after a long moment it turned and went through the back of the barn, through the place where 2 boards had rotted out at the base of the wall and left a gap just large enough, moving through that gap with a deliberateness that told me it had used it before, probably many times, probably for years. I stood in the barn for a long time after it was gone, the trouble lamp swinging, my shoulder aching, the smell of something dense and wild mixing with the smell of grease and old hay and cold air coming through the gap in the barn boards. Then I went to the house. I put my back against the kitchen wall and stood there in the dark of my own kitchen, and I understood something I had been not quite understanding for 7 years. I was not the one who had been deciding the terms of this arrangement. Not really. I had been the one setting food on a stone, yes. I had been the one moving closer, extending my hand. But the shape of what this had become, the radius of it, the pace of it, the years of it, that had been decided by something else, by something older and more deliberate and more patient than I was ever going to be. The barn wall had been studied for years before it let itself be seen. That was not the behavior of a wild animal. And Silas had been sent to the stone, or allowed to come to the stone, or guided to the stone, in a way that I was only now, standing in my cold, dark kitchen, beginning to understand the shape of. I was not the one who had found Silas. I was the one who had been found. I stayed up most of that night. I sat in the kitchen with the light off and looked out the window at the field. The lantern on the porch made a small orange circle in the dark. The stone sat in it, empty and still. Around 2 in the morning, I saw a shape move across the far edge of the field and stop at the tree line and stand there for a while, looking toward the house. The large one, standing at the edge of the field as it had stood in those earliest years, watching. I raised my hand against the glass. I don't know why. I raised my hand against the cold kitchen window in the middle of the night and held it there. The shape at the tree line stayed for another minute, and then moved back into the trees. I put my hand down. I stood at the window until the sky started to lighten, pale and gray in the east, and the field came back from the dark, the stubble frost white and still, the stone sitting at the corner of the porch where I had left it all those years ago, or where something had placed it all those years ago. On a cold morning, when the world I thought I knew turned out to be larger and stranger than any map I'd been given had suggested. 2 weeks after the barn, the last week of September, 2010. I came out in the morning to put food on the stone, and the stone was gone, not moved, not repositioned, gone. I walked the field. I checked the ditch and the fence line and the tree line edge and the garden beds. Nothing. The shale was simply no longer where it had been. A slight depression in the gravel at the porch corner was the only mark it left. A pale rectangle in the darker gravel, the ghost of where it had sat for 7 years. I stood there, looking at that absence for a long time. The morning was cold and still, and the sky above the oaks was white and flat and ungiving. I knew what it meant. I knew it the way you know a door has been closed when you hear the latch click, and not just the swing of the door. I never saw Silas again after that morning. I watched the field that fall, and through the winter that followed. I listened for the knock in the trees. I looked for tracks in the creek bank mud the following spring when the water was low, and the mud was soft and ready to hold a record of what had passed. Nothing. The South Woods gave back nothing. They had taken back what was theirs, and left me with the gravel depression and the cold mornings and the habit of looking at the field edge in the dusk. A habit I never fully stopped. Herschel died in 2012. Heart attack, his daughter told me when she called to say they were putting the property up for sale. I went to the service. I stood in the back of a Lutheran church in a town I almost never went to, and I looked at the back of Herschel's daughter's head, and I thought about the day he had come down my driveway with his hat in his hands, working the brim in a circle, not looking at me when he said what he needed to say. I thought about the two of us sharing something we never directly acknowledged to each other again, carrying it separately through the years that followed. Each of us knowing the other knew, neither of us ever speaking it plainly. That is the way men like us handled things we couldn't explain. We carried them alone and sideways, and we kept showing up to the next day's work. I am 63 now. I still live on this land. The south field still runs to the same tree line. The creek still runs iron and cold in October. The barn still has the gap at the base of the back wall. I replaced the boards 3 times, and each time they rotted out again in the same place, the same 2 boards, as though something was ensuring a door remained. I stopped replacing them after the 3rd time. I leave them. There is an honesty in leaving them. I don't put food out anymore. There is no stone to put it on. But I notice things. I notice the way the birds stop in the south field sometimes in the early morning, and then start again, and the pattern of that stopping. I notice the way the creek bank mud sometimes shows depressions that are not clearly anything but are not quite nothing. I notice the way the cold air from the south woods carries a particular density in certain seasons, a heaviness that has nothing to do with weather. I notice these things, and I do not speak them out loud to anyone, and I do not do anything about them. I just note that the world is larger than the map, and that sometimes what you lose is not what you thought you lost, and that what stays with you after something like this is not memory exactly, because memory is something you hold. What stays is more like being held. By 7 years of cold mornings and dark fields, and a young thing eating from your open hand, and the weight of a flat piece of shale that was moved by something larger than yourself, and returned to you and taken away again. What I know now, that I did not know when I first crouched over that track in the creek bank mud in October of 2003, is this. You do not find the wild things. They find you. And when they are done with what they came for, they leave. And the leaving is as deliberate and as complete as the finding was. And you are left standing in your own field, older than you were, looking at the place where a stone used to sit, understanding that you were the one who was fed all along,